Good morning, everybody. It is day 9. It's Thursday.
Good morning. Good morning. It's Thursday, week 2, although it feels like year 2. But we're glad you're back with us today. We're kind of excited about the conversation that we're about to have.
This is Dulce-Marie Flecha. Is that right, Flecha?
Flecha.
Flecha. I practiced. The reason that I was so drawn to your work is I was on the hashtag Clear the Air thread one night, listening to a lot of conversations that I found inspiring and challenging for me to think about. And you were commenting on that thread, and I started following you. So I've been following your work for a while, your thinking. And I posted on our thread on Padlet a link to the article that you wrote about defiantly teaching. And I just wanted to read 2 sentences from that. I've dedicated a career to studying and teaching in the intersection between learning and pain. That is a powerful line, followed by, I teach for the kids who are defiantly alive. That's just beautifully said.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. And when I look at your Twitter feed, you describe yourself as an alt-ed educator, bilingual special ed, plus mobility, plus literacy, plus trauma, plus story slinger. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what that all means.
Sure. Well, first I gotta give credit to DJ Older because he coined the phrase story slinger. I've stuck it in my bio at his consent, with his consent. I have kind of an odd career trajectory for a teacher anywhere. I'm actually the daughter of teachers. I'm the cousin of teachers. I'm the great niece of teachers in the Dominican Republic. My mother was a teacher, early childhood bilingual, for nearly 20 years. My cats are fighting in the background. Give me one second. For nearly 20 years in Harlem. And I'm also bilingual. I started off in special education high school at an international network for public school before transitioning to teaching on-site at homeless shelters. And currently I'm educational leadership at a foster care agency for unaccompanied and separated migrant children. So it's been an odd journey. I've missed teaching so much. In 1 second, I'm gonna get the cats to stop.
Are you spraying them?
Yes. Sorry. I told you at some point they're gonna make their presence known during this conversation. I thought it would be by standing in front of the camera, but they got creative. So I transitioned from traditional mainstream education to alternative education, specifically in shelter spaces. So I'm actually no longer working for the Department of Education. I was working under the Department of Homeless Services. I had a classroom on site at a homeless shelter. And now I work under a program that is supervised by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So I'm serving unaccompanied and separated migrant children. My overwhelming focus has always been language and literacy. It's what I love to do, but very, very specifically for children who, due to circumstances entirely outside of their control, it's really a result of inequity, just compounded inequity, compounded racism, ableism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. Like when you walk into a homeless shelter, I didn't have any white students. I didn't. I haven't had a white student for 5 years, ever since I left, because I specifically work in these spaces. And so you walk in and you just are a witness to the consequences, like the very real consequences and the very real pain that inequity causes structurally throughout communities. That's my work. I focus on mobility and alternative education specifically. So I'm working with kids who are highly transitional. There's a pretty high recidivism rate in the New York City shelter system that I'm sure is absolutely going to skyrocket due to the current economic crisis. It actually takes several tries to get into a New York City homeless shelter. The average family doesn't get in on the first try. You have to apply for a shelter placement. And usually it takes 2 or 3. So, and most of those people do end up coming back. New York City is expensive, and everything feels like it's just getting so much worse now. There are other alternative educators who really specifically have other areas of focus. So like someone teaching at a juvenile detention center with kids who are involved in the justice system, they know their kids will be with them for a significant amount of time, and that changes the way they frame their literacy instruction. I operate from the understanding that my kids could be gone tomorrow, and that frames my literacy instruction. I also operate from the understanding that like we're not learning in English. I actually teach entirely in Spanish. All my staff teach entirely in Spanish. So it's just different. I want to also acknowledge that alternative education means a lot of different things depending on the setting. That was a lot.
Well, and I was writing down all these things at once. The idea that when you think about literacy instruction, you're framing it around these kids could be gone tomorrow. It's going to change so much about what it is that you bring into that classroom, that space where you're trying to give them literacy, some kind of love of words and ideas. And could you just talk about how do you plan? What do you plan? What do you do?
We operate very, very much on skills, and not necessarily just the skills that I'm giving you, but the skills that you already have walking into my classroom. I was recently reading, because I'm writing something for Medium on interrupted formal education, and New York State defines, like, it says, who are students with interrupted formal education? And then the first sentence is talking about how low their literacy levels are. And I talk to all my staff about operating from the understanding these kids are very much literate. They might not be print literate,
right,
but they have literacies, or else how on earth would they have survived the journey to the United States in the first place? And I think that's also applicable for all of any school. If a child wasn't literate, they wouldn't have made it to your public school. Or if someone in their lives were illiterate, they wouldn't have made it to your public school classroom. If that little Latinx multilingual student wasn't some form of literate, they won't be surviving in your English speaking classroom. They do. If that Black student wasn't some form of literate, socially literate, they wouldn't be surviving in the classroom of a white teacher who was indoctrinated by a very white educational field. That's literacy and it's valuable. So that's the core part of my instruction in my classroom space and what I train my teachers in. Like, these kids are not illiterate. They might not be reading print, but they're very literate. And the first thing we have to do is acknowledge that and celebrate that. And then we really focus on core skills, like what are the things that we want to reinforce. For me, it's very rarely decoding. It takes a long time to learn how to decode. That tends to be very structured in terms of beginning, middle, and end. So we do what we can, but that's a tough thing. We struggle just generally with making long-term plans. We have kids coming into our program and kids leaving our program every day. Instead, we focus on more like critical analysis. Sequencing is one of my favorite skills to teach. There's a cat sighting. Characterization, like navigating, identifying plot, identifying setting, just things that can be applied without necessarily needing to decode.
Fascinating. I think, there's a couple things, and Kelly, please jump in. I just been thinking the whole time. I've been working with some people, Matt Glover is one of them, with the idea that how do you use strength in one literacy to lift another? So if a kid comes in and they don't read well, but they are your best podcaster, they read people better than anybody, how do you use that, leverage that in order, like I had my kids recording their drafts and listening to what they had recorded it before they wrote them. So they talked aloud their drafts, kids who don't write well. And I think that your idea that, number one, it's the orientation. These are not deficits. These are kids who have strengths in these areas, and we need to think of them as kids with these strengths that we then can help them use those strengths to lift other literacies. Does that make sense with what you were saying?
Yeah.
And I don't do it in a bilingual setting, but I have certainly deeply understood the inequities that you're talking about, and the inequities in what curriculum gets attention in our school systems and whose voices are valued and whose are missing. And I think your observation of, I haven't had a white student in 5 years, and that homeless shelters and foster care where you work are just representative of all of the systems in this country that contribute to that. That's a really important observation for all of us to think about.
So when I hear you talk, Dulce, I'm thinking, that gap is already widened for many of the reasons that you outlined, and I'm just concerned that in the days ahead, and not just your population, but I'm in a everyday school. I see kids every day, but I work with kids who do not have access to a lot of computers and things like that. And I'm just wondering, like this whole thing is going to lead to even more of a widening of the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And I think you're concerned that it may actually end up flooding even more the homeless and foster care situation. Is really, really discouraging to me. The second thing is, I'm wondering in your world, given what you've learned with these kids, what you might want to say to teachers who are in, like, what are some of the lessons you've learned that might be applicable to all teachers, teachers who might be in the classroom every day with their kids?
I think one of the things I'm actually currently writing about, it'll be on my Medium page maybe today, that I might be expecting a lot of myself, maybe tomorrow, is this idea of interrupted formal education as being more than how many grade levels is the child behind, as being more than how often is the kid absent from school, but like how often is their learning interrupted by any factor, regardless of whether or not they're physically present. I think one of the bigger challenges that schools can anticipate, that my setting is definitely going to have to anticipate, but your settings as well, is that we were formerly, like school settings were formerly deemed unsafe for children. A lot of us have known that for children of color, these settings were already unsafe. They were not necessarily stable, but we are formally deemed biologically unsafe by the government of our state. And so how do we repair that relationship? Like, how do we repair that trust? Why should they believe that we're safe now? Why should they believe that we're clean? Why should they believe that we're not sick? Like, what are we going to do to make this place feel safe? Not just the children who have to show up, but also the caregivers who have to send their children. I think that is going to be my priority, walking back into the school more than anything necessarily academic, because I don't think we're going to have a lot of academic success unless we address this sense of like disrupted safety and this anxiety and how difficult it is to be anywhere that's not home right now. I think as well, we tend to think of interrupted formal education as, again, like they define it as literacy level, as a certain number of grade levels behind. That's how the MLS works actually in New York State, the formal self-assessment that specifically measures how below grade level you are. And if you hit below a certain number, then you're a student with interrupted formal education. If you haven't gone to school in 3 years, but you're still around grade level, you're not necessarily defined as interrupted formal education. I like to propose that interruptions to education can happen while a child is still in the building due to the impact of trauma, due to the impact of mental health, due to the impact of anxiety, that it can be incredibly difficult for anyone to like focus cognitively for the duration of a school day if they are still coping with the symptoms of trauma. That means that this label of students with uninterrupted formal education will suddenly become a lot more difficult to measure. I don't think the measurement is necessarily the point. I think the point is thinking more critically about how we are adding additional entry points and how we are reinforcing previous skill sets and reviewing information to make sure that the kids who may have missed a little bit of formal schooling because they were coping emotionally, enacting a coping mechanism, maybe trying to save themselves from dysregulation while they were in your classroom space and weren't able to necessarily concentrate or practice what you were trying to teach. I think it says a lot more about entry points and review and trauma-informed classrooms than it necessarily does about grade level. I can understand how this is scary because it's scary not to be able to like track. But I think it's just is necessary. We need to broaden our thinking if we're going to do any kind of service to the kids who are having their education formally interrupted right now.
Well,
And the kids.
we've talked to a lot of teachers in a lot of places before this entire epidemic hit, and even before the epidemic hit, we teachers across the country have been telling us just an intense increase in depression, an incredible increase in self-harm, suicidal thoughts, and now I can only imagine that's going to go into hyper mode given the events that are unfolding as we speak. I'm wondering if maybe, because you have been very public in talking about some of your own struggles, maybe you could share some thinking on that and what that might mean for teachers as well.
Yeah, I've talked about my bipolar disorder online before and in person before with anyone who's willing to have that conversation with me. Um, I'm doing a lot better now. I'm very privileged in that, like, I still have access to my supports. So I had therapy yesterday. It was just online. I have health insurance, so I can keep seeing my psychiatrist. Sit down, Bobby. Get to lay down, my guy. Not everyone will, especially given like employment is not necessarily guaranteed. When you're teaching in a foster care agency, I just lucked out in that I still have a job. I don't know if there's necessarily a correct way for an individual teacher to address their mental health, and it definitely has interrupted my own formal education, both as a graduate student and also as a teacher. But I think one of the things that's really important to me going forward, especially as I have a little bit more space in my life and I'm doing better, is advocating for teacher access to mental health support and like advocating for really connecting with educators about what it means to be mentally ill and how like it can be dangerous and it can be lifelong, but you can still function.
But and gosh, that's such a brave thing for you to share publicly. But when I go into a classroom and I have 30 something kids in there and I know 5 of them are really, really traumatized and really having a hard time and do not have maybe some of the supports that you are fortunate enough to have had in your life. It kind of refocuses on what's important in that classroom, that the connection has to come first, right? It has to, I don't know, jump in, Penny, if you want here, but it just seems so important that we recognize that first. Penny and I have said this many times, we teach kids, we don't teach stuff, right? And you have to know what your kids are going through to be able to even gain any traction with them.
Yeah, I was curious. I mean, because Kelly and I do a lot of work with teachers on how to find space for kids to tell the stories they want to tell, and that they have control over who gets to read those stories. So our kids do a lot of work in notebooks, and my students always know that they're giving me permission to read parts of it, but that I don't read all of it. And I want a space where they know it's theirs. But it doesn't seem enough. When you say trauma-informed classrooms, could you tell us a little bit about what that is? How do I make my classroom a trauma-informed classroom?
I think there are a couple of different facets to it. The first is educating yourself. It doesn't necessarily mean educating yourself on the individual stories of each child. That's not sustainable to begin with. You'll burn out emotionally. And you just can't know which one of your children are experiencing trauma and which children are not. There's some signs that might be a bit more visible. There are also signs that you might not see. Instead, focus on educating yourself about the structures that traumatize, like structural trauma, which is related to community inequity, and which is why I got so involved in Clear the Air in the first place. They're reading The Color of Law, and mobility is what I do. And to also educate yourself about trauma generally, as opposed to trying to educate yourself about trauma in a specific child. And then you create like structural supports within your classroom that might anticipate and provide space, and really importantly, provide autonomy to children who might be experiencing trauma. Again, this is not the sort of thing that's very easy to track. You provide as many opportunities as you can, you provide as many structures as you can, and then you let children access those structures.
Can you give us an example of what one of those structures might be?
For me, I think Penny's example is a really important one in trauma-informed literacy, in asking for consent before you read something, or asking for consent before you conference with someone. I think, I know a lot of my staff, actually, I don't think, a lot of them use feelings charts, which comes from Ben Street's Emotionally Responsive Classroom, which just gives kids, again, an opportunity, not necessarily a mandate, to quickly check in about how they're feeling. And involved in that is giving them language and like explicitly teaching social emotional language, so that kids can begin to label how they're feeling. And then hopefully down the line, when they really need to use that language, they'll have it in their toolkit. And then they'll also have teachers who are adults who they might be able to communicate with. I think one of the things that my site does very, very well is that the teachers know kids outside of their classroom, and the kids know the teachers outside of their classroom. And so when a child begins to dysregulate, our first line of defense is usually actually not a clinician, even though we have a big team of them. Our first line of defense is the teacher who we already know that child connects with very well. And so we'll call like Mr. Robert to come in and say, like, can you please talk to Fulanito? He's having a tough day. He asked for you. I'll cover your class. Whatever you're doing, I'll cover your class, and go talk to Fulanito because he's in pain.
I love that. And that is such a vision for a team of people who are working together for the good of all kids, right? And schools can be that. I've been in schools where we do that well, where teams of teachers are together and you're looking out for other kids, and you're understanding that kids kind of form alliances with different people. They, whatever it is, it was, if Kelly and I were teaching, there'd be kids who respond better to him than to me for all kinds of reasons. And just to set aside your own personal need to be liked by everyone and allow kids to choose who it is that they need to be with. And I think that schools are often horrible places for kids to get immediate help. In my building, it was always like, well, no, there are no counselors available, or you have to sign up for an appointment and it's in, 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And that idea that they're not very responsive when kids are in trouble, and it is put on teachers.
My school, though, has gone to a system in which we have certain language that if we call, it's an actual warm handoff of a kid. A kid who's having a hard time is not just on his own sent the counselor, but there is a human contact that comes and embraces the kid and makes sure the kid is safe. And I think that's evolving as we see more and more issues with our kids.
Yeah.
Maybe as we're heading here to our time limit that we try to keep every day, Dulce, maybe we should end with this idea that you are a story slinger. And we have read some of your work. I love your piece about your abuela and how she used to write poems and prayers for the New York Yankees, even though I am a left coast baseball fan, not a right coast baseball fan. But I just think that is such a beautiful piece of writing, and I will use that as a little mentor text as I go back into the classroom. It's such a beautiful piece. Maybe we'll link that as well.
Yeah.
Could you just we'll wrap up a little bit today by just talking to us about yourself as a writer, your process, when and where you write, how you find time in your busy life to do that? Because we think it's really important that teachers who teach writing are actually writers themselves.
Yeah, I actually wrote that after seeing Jason Reynolds' keynote at TCRWP. It was just really special. He was talking about the power of people of color telling their own stories, and I wanted to write about my home. So I found an empty classroom at TC. I skipped the session, and and I wrote about Abuela. Yeah, there's a lot of power in really understanding yourself as a writer and believing in yourself as a writer and teaching yourself as a writer. I used to call myself a reader. I still do. I call myself a reader before I'm a writer, and I'm obsessed with Jasmine Ward. That's my big.
No kidding.
Oh my God. Sing Unburied Sing is gorgeous.
It is gorgeous.
And it has one of the most stunning writing. I'm obsessed with this writing technique where she she invokes imagery, but instead of using nouns, she uses verbs. And they're all just water-based. Like it was rushing, it was flowing, it was waving. And that's how you get the sense of like water, as opposed to saying a river of tears, which is how I was doing it. It's so powerful. I have the book over there and I just stuck a post-it every time she did it. So I think giving yourself time to write, yes, but also giving yourself time to read and giving yourself time to really celebrate the things that you love so much about writing technique. So doing essentially the same thing you ask your students to do, identifying writer's craft, picking your favorites and practicing. And I'm not good enough, or I'm not instinctively doing that yet, where I'm using verbs to invoke imagery, but it's a goal of mine that I have because I was reading like I tell my students to read. I don't know the time thing. I have to
when and where do you write? Do you carve out a specific time? Are you a morning writer, evening writer?
I have been trying as I'm home to give myself like between 12 and 3 or between like 1 and 4 might be my writing time. I've been struggling a little bit with stamina. I have a hard time just sitting and writing, and I'm very like, I revise as I write. So I'll write a sentence, realize I want to change one word, scratch it out, as opposed to just free writing, which is what Harim Khan has been begging me to do for years. You can see my writing space. It's actually where the cats were fighting. It's like right there.
Lovely.
Everything in this is my library, and everything in here is a hand-me-down from my family or from my roommate or just from people who love me. And so it's nice to just kind of be surrounded by that. Yeah, I have my desk and I sit. I'm usually here. I'm facing the Grand Concourse. This is the apartment I grew up in. So this is the apartment that I started writing in. This is the room that I wanted to write the next Harry Potter in. And now I'm writing recipes about Cardi B and apple pie. So not quite Harry Potter, but
I actually saw this. I thought that was awesome. You know what? I am so glad you brought up Jesmyn Ward, because as we say goodbye to you, I want to tell the people that watch us that one of my pet peeves is that there are 5 writers in the history of American literature who've won the National Book Award twice. 4 white men and 1 black woman, Jesmyn Ward. And she is so rarely recognized as this giant of American literature. And so Salvage the Bones is the one that I came to first. The Men We Reaped, the story of the people she's lost, is incredible. But Sing and Buried Sing took me to an entirely different place. The multiple narrators, the movements in time. I think that if this interview could give teachers some light on trauma, but also lead them to Jesmyn Ward, I'd say we did pretty good work today.
So please, everyone, read Jesmyn Ward and just think about the craft. Like, think about the technique she was using. It's brilliant, and it's the exact sort of thing you want your kids to do anyway. Practice what you're out there teaching.
Absolutely.
We loved her in our faculty book club as well.
Yeah. So thank you so much for your time. I truly appreciate this. Is during your writing time that you're talking to us. So thank you for doing that, because we're interrupting. What is your...
Oh, no, it's absolutely fine. Thank you for having me again. And I'm so sorry about the cats being so badly behaved.
We're pet friendly.
That's right.
Nice to meet you, Dulce. Thank you so much for sharing your thinking with us.
Absolutely.
It was great to meet you.